2% most likely would. Some of them are a bit wary, somewhat disagree, 14%, and those strongly disagreeing there is 10%. As I say, these figures change. What we are seeing here is actually a vote of confidence in the government. And I'll show you about Russia down the bottom. 33% of Russians strongly disagree about being vaccinated, and another 21% somewhat disagree. That's a much bigger figure, and it basically reflects what they think about their government, frankly. And here's another survey that actually came out a little while ago. There's this trust reckoning barometer called the Edelman Trust Barometer, as how much you trust your government. Distrust red, trust blue, neutral grayish color. The greatest decline in 2020 in distrust was, or rather the greatest increase in distrust or decline in trust was in China, minus 10%. The greatest increase in Australia was in Australia, plus 12%. So it shows we're increasingly trusting our government to give us the right advice. Okay, but the big question, of course, in everybody's mind is what? To vaccinate or not vaccinate? That's the big question. And it is a question which a lot of people are considering personally, and perhaps even making a noise about it, as we saw recently with thousands of, well, hundreds, not thousands, hundreds of people protesting in the streets about vaccination, saying it was compulsory. Well, that, for a start, is not correct, because it will not be compulsory in Australia, although it may end up being compelled in certain jobs and in certain circumstances, like flying as passenger. Okay, now, what about this term herd immunity? We've heard a lot about herd immunity. There are people in the country who believe that they can not get vaccinated and still be safe because the majority of the population has been vaccinated. Well, that's about the most selfish comment I think you could make, isn't it? That, oh, well, I won't get vaccinated because all you lot are being vaccinated. But what is herd immunity? First of all, if you look over on the top part of this diagram, if no one is immunized in the community from an infectious disease, and it doesn't matter which one, but COVID-19 is the example here, then the vast majority are going to end up with the disease. If some of the population gets immunized, then the spread of the disease slows down, but still the majority of the population will get the disease. And if most of the population are immunized, then the chances of it spreading between people who have actually got the disease to those who haven't is simply diluted, so that it gets to the point where the disease does not spread. It may still persist, but it doesn't spread. Now, so we've tried to say what herd immunity is. It's actually a statistical construct. It's actually the mathematicians put this together. And it is achieved when one infected person in a population generates less than one secondary case on average throughout the course of their disease. So that makes sense, doesn't it? That if you are sick and you only ever spread it to less than one person, if that's possible, then the disease will gradually die out. You can express it in mathematical terms, and I won't go into that because even I don't fully understand what that thing means. But anyway, so how does COVID-19 stack up as far as herd immunity is concerned? The percentage of the population needing to be vaccinated for successful herd immunity is dependent on multiple factors. First of all, how infectious is the virus? Very infectious for COVID-19, and even more so with the last two mutations that we've run across from the UK and South Africa. How long is the incubation period? That's interesting because longer incubation periods, if you are infectious during the incubation period, means you'll spread it to a lot more people without knowing it. And that's exactly what the COVID-19 virus can do, what we call the SARS-2 virus. Up to 10 days before you might develop symptoms. How densely populated is the community? Now, this is obvious, isn't it? If there's a lot of people around and you're contacting a lot of people, then the spread will be more rapid and end up with a worse situation. The densely populated cities are clearly the worst, and those who are living close by each other, worse still. How is the virus transmitted? We know that. Very easily, by contact and aerosol. How long are infected persons infectious for? Now, this has been looked at, and it's not absolutely clear. It appears that some people, a small minority, may be infectious for longer than the average 2 weeks for when we quarantine people. So it may be up to 3 weeks, and it could be even longer.
Yeah, thanks.
Hello. What is the likely percentage of the population immunised that will create this herd immunity for COVID-19? The best current estimates are 67% of the population. Now, it could be higher, it certainly wouldn't be lower. There are other questions as well that we need to look at, and we'll go through some of those as we talk. Okay, so let's see about which vaccine we might be considering. Now, in regard to this, there are both medical and ethical issues to discuss. So we will look at those both. A little bit of history of vaccination, though. The word vaccine or vaccination comes from the Latin vacca, which means a cow. And a lot of you will have known about this, that in 1797, a man called Edward Jenner began to vaccinate people against smallpox by using another virus which was very closely related and infected the udders of cows. And he discovered that milkmaids actually never got smallpox, or if they did, they got a very minor degree of smallpox. And it was because they had already been infected with the cowpox as they were milking the cows. So he got the cowpox from the cows and he injected it into people, and they had a very high rate of immunity against smallpox. Now, smallpox was possibly second only to the plague in the number of people it killed throughout Europe and the world. And interestingly, as way back in even as far as the 15th or 16th centuries, there had been developed a way of protecting people against smallpox. It was called inoculation, and it was common in the Middle East. And what they used to do is they would take a sample of the virus, like just some of the pustular material out of somebody's face or arms, and inject it into a person who hadn't got smallpox. Now, what happened was that produced an immunity which actually ended up protecting 90-odd% of those who had it against smallpox. They got a minor disease. Some of them got a serious disease. About 2% died. So it wasn't a perfect vaccination by any means. But the cowpox vaccination of Jenner was very effective. Now, a lot of our vaccines, by the way, the cowpox vaccine is what we call a live vaccine. You use a live virus in order to create immunity. You don't want to use the virus that actually causes the disease until it has been what we call attenuated. And if you pass it through tissue culture many times, often it will lose its ability to cause serious disease. And this is what has been done with a number of vaccines. And I would guess that the majority of you guys have actually had one or more of these. That's one. The measles vaccine, that's another. The mumps vaccine's another. Rubella, the varicella and zoster vaccines, that's chickenpox. And the yellow fever vaccine. All of those are actually live viruses that have been injected into your body. Oh dear, what about my DNA? We'll come to that a bit later. Now, these two gentlemen, one Japanese and one German, were awarded the Nobel Prize in 1901 for developing non-live vaccines. And these are vaccines where the virus or the bacterium has actually been killed and then injected. So it can't cause a disease, but it's still antigenic. It can still promote an immune response. And so there are quite a few examples of that, which we'll run through. These are so-called dead vaccines, if you want to call them that. The Salk polio vaccine, that's the one I had when I was a kid. Hepatitis A vaccine. Most influenza vaccines are actually killed viruses. The typhoid vaccine, the cholera vaccine, and the pertussis, or the whooping cough vaccine. Okay, now let's have a look at the coronavirus vaccines. We'll briefly go through the different types. The first one, which was the first to be developed, were called mRNA or messenger RNA vaccines, and that was the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines. Then there are some DNA vaccines that are using DNA itself. Then there are so-called viral vector vaccines, and the AstraZeneca one is the main one that we're encountering. And what we call the protein subunit vaccines, which is still in development stage. So mRNA, DNA, viral vector, and protein subunit. Let's move along. So some of the examples of the live coronavirus vaccines are the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. Now, this is not live coronavirus. Let's get this correct. You are not going to be injected with a live or even an attenuated coronavirus. This is a new development which has been around a little while, but this particular vaccine works in a particular way, which we'll go into shortly. A few facts about it. The vaccine is what we call a live viral vector vaccine, and it actually uses a chimpanzee adenovirus as carrier or vector for the SARS-2 or coronavirus spike protein, the genetic code fragment of it in the form of DNA. Now, let me explain what happens. What they do is they take this chimpanzee virus and they can fiddle with the DNA by taking out the part that allows the virus to multiply. So once you do that, it can't actually cause any disease. And then they replace that part of the DNA with a segment of DNA that has been coded to make the spike protein, or one of the spike proteins of this coronavirus. They've inserted that into the DNA of this adenovirus. And then the adenovirus becomes a vector. So when it gets into you and into any of your cells, it goes in there. The DNA fragment that codes for the spike 2 protein does enter the nucleus of cells, but it does not combine with your DNA. What it does is it sits there and it makes some messenger RNA, which goes outside the nucleus into the cytoplasm and starts to make spike protein. Now, why make spike protein? Spike protein is that part of that multiple little spiky things that sit on the outside of the virus. And the spike protein is the bit that actually helps the virus to get inside your cells by locking on to a receptor on your cells, which has been present, a normal receptor. It receives a number of different messages from different types of things, but the virus knows about it and can dock, if you like, and then get inside your cells. If you can make antibodies to this spike protein, you wreck that mechanism and the virus can't get inside your cells. Basically, that's how it works. Now, there were 3 phases of trials that were started with this vaccine. Phase 1 is with animals, phase 2 is with a limited number of human beings. Phase 3 is when you have large numbers of human beings, both in Brazil and the UK, had the vaccine. Now, this was a double-blind trial. What that means is that half of the people got the vaccine and half of them got a placebo, which had no effect. Now, that's a little bit dicey in terms of the fact that these people are going to be subjected to this virus in the environment, and the ones who got the placebo are likely to get very seriously ill. But unless you do it this way, you really don't have a very accurate way of telling how effective the vaccine itself is. Okay, so a little bit more about this vaccine. They completed phase 3 trials in December last year. It was approved in the UK in December 29 and is being used, as you know, in an active immunisation campaign in the UK. Reports that the vaccine is only 62% effective are exaggerated and misleading, and we need to actually look at that. So let's look at the actual data. Now, these are from, this is from a website for doctors called Medscape, and it looks at lots of actual peer-reviewed articles about it. And what we know about the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine is that just by happenstance, on some of the trial participants, they used a half a dose and then they used a full dose. And they found that the ones who had the full dose first and then a month later the full dose second didn't get as good a response as if they had the half a dose and then the full dose. So let's have a look at the results. 90% efficacy depending on the dosage. So if you average out those two groups, those who had the half dose and full dose, those who had the full dose twice, then the average efficacy was 70.4%. Now, what's interesting here is what happens with severe disease. Okay, with the number of patients in the trials, and I think there was something like multiple thousands anyway, maybe 9 or 10,000 altogether. They got 131 COVID-19 cases from 21 days after the first dose and 10 hospitalizations, all in the placebo group. Now, that's very important. These are the ones who had what maybe a saline injection, but not the actual vaccine. And unfortunately, 2 were classified as severe and 1 died. Now, when that gets to any extensive sort of situation in a trial like this, they say, uh-oh, we know the results of this, we better stop this because we're giving people saline and some of them are dying. And so that's what they did. All in the placebo group were the ones who were seriously affected. Okay, newer types of vaccines, what we call subunit vaccines. That means it's not a whole virus. So the mRNA vaccines are very interesting. Now, some of you have probably done biology, either in high school or maybe even after high school in university, I don't know. So maybe some of you will know a lot of this and be able to follow easily. I'll try and make it as simple as possible. Okay, so the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines are what we call messenger RNA vaccines. And they actually make the spike protein inside your cells. It does then get outside your cells. The body has a look at it and says, hey, we don't like this, let's make antibodies to it. And so they do, and they can then attack the virus. And there are viral protein vaccines that are still not fully developed, but are on the way. There's one called Novavax, which is actually just the spike protein, nothing else. Okay, so how did this work? Oh, the data, first of all. These are the data from the original phase 3 trial of the Pfizer vaccine. 95% effective. You've heard this on the news, no doubt. So that's pretty good. They had 170 confirmed cases of COVID-19, 162 in the placebo group, and 8 in the vaccine group. 10 severe cases after the first dose, 9 in the placebo group and 1 in the vaccine group. And so they found that also it was effective not only against the original virus, but against the 2 mutants that had developed, the UK and South African variants. It was effective against them as well. So it's been emergency use authorized in the US and here and in Europe, in some places in Europe and also in the UK and many other places, no doubt. Okay, the Novavax vaccine, this is a new one, so you won't hear much about this. They've only done phase 1 and I think phase 2 trials, so phase 3 trial is supposed to have ended soon, but it started in November, so they don't have all the data yet. And it was just a protein vaccine, but we'll go into that well, we won't go into that in too much detail because it's not applicable to us here. Not yet, anyway. Now, people have asked about adjuvants. Well, what's added to these vaccines that might be dangerous or cause trouble? Well, they used to put into vaccines some adjuvants which had a degree of concern because it was said that they may be toxic. Well, it's probably not true, but basically they moved away from those type of adjuvants into more natural occurring adjuvants. And most of the adjuvants these days are actually plant derived. And they're what we call saponins. And they actually help to disperse the vaccine in the tissue somewhat. So they're like soapy substances, if you like. Okay. Now, very quickly about the University of Queensland vaccine that has died a death, as you know, because what happened is that they used a protein which is derived from the HIV virus, and it caused an antibody response in some of the trial participants. Now, it wasn't the HIV virus, it was only one protein from that virus, and exactly why they used it, I'm not entirely sure. But it then showed up as a false positive HIV test in some of the participants. So the implications of that would be that if they had become exposed to the HIV virus in the future, there would be no way to tell whether they'd been truly infected with HIV or whether it was just this vaccine they'd had. So a bit of a problem. So they cancelled the development of that vaccine. They halted it in late last year, as you know, I'm sure. Now, what about Germany's decision not to use the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine for over 65s? They were saying, well, you know, 62% efficacy if it's given as 2 double doses. Well, first of all, you don't give it as 2 double doses. You give it as a half and then 1, and you get a better result. But there's some other things here. They're claiming that there's insufficient data of the effectiveness in the older population. But let's have a look at this in economic terms. The German government invested 445 million in the development of the Pfizer vaccine and not for the AstraZeneca one. Pfizer was founded by 2 German Americans, and the company which actually works with Pfizer is BioNTech, a German company. AstraZeneca is a Swedish UK company, and the vaccine development is based in the UK. Now, I know if you have ever watched some of the British TV programs, you'd be saying, don't mention the war. But have a look at this. We know that Angela Merkel isn't a great political friend of our otherwise friend Boris Johnson, because she was opposed to Brexit and he wasn't, of course. So we need to ask ourselves, is the German decision purely based on science or are politics involved? I'll leave that up to you. Quickly, how do vaccine antibodies work? Now, a quick tutorial on immunity. You are born with what's called innate immunity, which means that your body is able to fight and put up a defense against certain infections by your immune cells that have a natural ability to fight against foreign things. And that is very variable. When you're born, you get some antibodies from your mum via the placenta, and you get a few more antibodies in the first couple of breastfeeds. So you're generally immune from most things that your mother is immune from for about 3 months, but after that, you're on your own. But your body does have the ability to fight infections naturally, kind of like a shotgun approach. So they can fight pretty well everything by using a generalized approach, if you like, but it's not highly targeted against certain particular infections. Your body has to learn how to accurately target against certain infections. And that's what we call the humoral response. So the humoral response means that your body will make antibodies to a foreign protein generally as part of a virus or a bacterium. But it takes about 10 days to 14 days for that to happen. And in the process, or in the meantime, you might be getting very ill. And when those antibodies attach to the virus, generally they damage it so much that the body can chew it up and spit it out. Now, there's a thing called cellular immunity, and what we're interested in with vaccines is, do they produce both a humoral response and a cellular response? And the answer to that is basically all of them do. So here's an infected cell, one of your body's cells, if you like. There's viruses inside it, there's viruses outside of it. And what happens is that we've got these things called natural killer cells, and they have been primed to do away with infected cells because they've been given messages about how to do it. And that's what we call a natural killer cell. And it actually kills the cell as well as the virus. Now, that's become a problem in COVID-19 because when you've got a lot of cells in your lungs infected by a virus, and you get this huge immune response from natural killer cells, and they produce a whole lot of nasties called cytokines that are there to kill off viruses, sure, but they also kill off your normal cells. And so you get an overreaction in the lung in certain people, about 2 to 4% of people who get it. Your body actually causes a lot of damage to itself. Okay. Now, how long will the immunity from COVID vaccines last? That's a very good question, and that's one that doesn't have an answer yet. We don't know. It could be that you will get long-lasting immunity, and it could be that your immunity will be much like the flu immunity you get from a flu vaccine, maybe last a year, and next year you'll have to have a new one. And that could be, we don't know. I can't answer that one for you, nobody can. There's no human data to establish whether vaccinated immunity will be long or short lasting. We know it is short. We know that it lasts at least a month to 3 months. We know that much. And the longer the vaccine programs go on and the research is done, the more we'll know, obviously. So there's a distinct possibility that you'll be lining up at your doctor for a vaccine once a year. I wouldn't be at all surprised if they end up combining 2 vaccines, so you get a flu and a COVID-19 together. Quite possible. What about virus mutations in vaccines? This has been of concern because there have been at least, the virus mutates about every 2 weeks. So already there would be hundreds, if not thousands of mutations out there, but a lot of the mutations that happen anywhere, the mutations that happen in cells in your body, the mutations that happen in viruses and bacteria, the vast majority are deleterious. This is why by the way, the Darwinists talk about mutations being helpful. Generally speaking, they're not. However, as far as the virus is concerned, at least 2 or 3 of them now have been helpful for the virus in that there's been 2 mutations, UK and South Africa, where the virus becomes more infective. Oh, we're going backwards, don't want that. Okay. So the early evidence is that despite that, at least 2 of the vaccines, or several of the vaccines we have now, will be effective against both of those mutant variants. There's a company that's developing a vaccine that binds to several sites on the virus, not just the spike protein, and that's coming down the track a little bit. And that's a little bit like having a shotgun as opposed to a 22. It attacks multiple areas of the virus, and it may end up being more effective. We don't know. Another approach, which has been suggested and might be a good idea, is to offer different vaccines for the first and second dose, or at different times. So you might have, for example, if you have to have it repeated, you might have the Pfizer vaccine this year and the AstraZeneca next year. I don't know. We don't know that either, but no doubt it'll be worked out. Okay, a bit more about this. The vaccine developers are also looking at rejigging the current vaccines. So, for example, if they've made a vaccine that's active against this particular part of the proteins on the spike of the virus, then perhaps if that's mutated, they'll make a vaccine that is against the mutation, and so on. For example, this happens every year with the flu virus, because the new vaccines are always made to the newer variants of the virus. the messenger RNA vaccines, the great advantage of them is that they can be very quickly upgraded, if you like, to affect the new mutant strains of the virus. What about other therapies? Now, this is a very important and interesting to us as Adventists because we are generally supportive of natural therapies and natural help for our bodies. It's likely that there'll be multiple strategies, by the way, to be developed to cope with the pandemic. For example, public health measures, which include limited quarantine, mask wearing, reduced close human contact, surface cleaning and hand sanitization will remain for some time. And this will continue to impact our churches. So that's a take-home message for you, that you may find for quite a considerable period, I suspect for most of this year anyway, there may still be some restrictions on what we can do and how we can do it. Just good hygiene, for example. Ellen White spoke a lot about hygiene. Just good hygiene, you know, washing your hands and that sort of thing is a good idea no matter what. Vaccination is the main strategy at present because it's commenced with the high-risk persons. For unvaccinated people at high risk, though, after exposure to the virus, then they've proved that monoclonal and polyclonal antibody treatment is effective in at least 50%. That's what President Trump had, by the way. And monoclonal and polyclonal antibodies are artificially manufactured antibodies. So they don't come from someone else. There's a thing called pooled antiserum, which you might collect pooled antiserum or antiserum from one person and then from another, and mix it all together, of people who had recovered from the coronavirus and had very high levels of antibodies formed in their body naturally. And you can give them to someone else and they will attack the virus. So that was actually the first type of immunotherapy that was ever developed, and it was used way back 100 more years ago, before antibiotics were developed. For example, there were vaccines, or not vaccines, but antibodies made against pneumonia and against rabies. Okay. For some people, and there are a proportion of the community who will not or probably should not have the vaccine. For example, pregnant women at the present time, they're saying probably not. Transplant recipients, well, if they got the vaccine, they wouldn't react because they're immunosuppressed. So for them, if they become exposed to the virus, then using someone else's antibodies or a monoclonal antibody might be very useful for them. And it would reduce the risk of both contracting the COVID-19 and of developing severe disease if you're exposed already to the virus. So, what about the implications of the vaccination issue for the church? Now, there are a number of ethical issues, and I'll refer you a bit later on to something that I did a while ago on the ethical issues, which you can look up on YouTube. But this is a possibility. If significant numbers of churchgoers refuse to be vaccinated, be prepared that some others may refuse to come to church. Now, that is going to be a possible significant impact, and I want you all to think about it because we already had this problem. I know of people who said, well, I can go to church on Zoom, you know, it's a long way and I don't want to risk this or that. I don't think I'm ever going to go back. And that could be an issue. Well, not could be, I suspect it definitely will be an issue for us. And we need to think about it very carefully. And that's not the purview of this talk. That's for you guys to work out individually in your own churches and perhaps collectively as well. Another big question. What about all of the misinformation out there? There's actually been fraud committed quite a bit. You see here that there was a Californian doctor who was prosecuted for selling miracle cures. No doubt about the United States. If somebody can make money out of something, they will. And here as well. Okay, so I would suggest that this outbreak has spawned more fraudulent claims, exploitative selling, scams, misinformation, conspiracy theories, and just plain fiction than any other news event in our lifetime. And just this usual general warning, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably ain't true. Some of these misleading claims which I want to deal with here. First of all, there are some people who claim that COVID-19 isn't a real disease. You know, it's caused by mobile phone towers or something. Well, tell that to these people. Then there's a claim that COVID-19 has a very low death rate, so it shouldn't be taken seriously. Well, here's a graph. It only goes to August 2020 of the deaths anomaly by week in the US. Now, deaths anomaly means the more deaths than are expected on a general population. And you can see that back in 2018, there was a bit of a spike. That was the flu. In January 2019, there was a downturn because people started isolating. They didn't get the flu and there wasn't much COVID-19 virus around, but well, there wasn't any then. So perhaps they were isolating because of the flu. I don't know. If you get up to January 2020 and then up to July, you see a huge spike. These figures are 20,000, and this is, I think, I forget, by week, yeah, weekly numbers, 20,000, 25,000 a week in the US. Now, there's this thing about a group of doctors, a large group of so-called doctors or scientists and so on, who say that the lockdowns really are not necessary and cause more trouble than they're worth. And the group that has done this is called, the biggest group, the Great Barrington Declaration, where there's a whole lot of scientists and people who've said, look, what we should be doing is not locking everything down. We should have focused protection. What that means is we should protect the people in the old people, you know, lock them away, protect the people in nursing homes, lock them away, and not bother about the rest of the population, you know, let them get the virus. Well, great. Except that, as we know, there's staff in nursing homes and some of them are going to get it. And that's exactly what happened in New South Wales with the nursing homes here. And it's exactly what happened in Victoria. The problem is that most of the people who signed this declaration are in countries like USA, America, Europe, UK, and so on, where the disease has gone rampant because their lockdowns were not properly implemented and not implemented early enough. And so they saw the problem and said, well, they don't work, so why use them? Well, they don't work because they didn't follow us. In Australia and in New Zealand, they've essentially worked, despite the problems that they developed. Okay. And then there's this claim that COVID-19 vaccines aren't very effective. Well, we've already looked at this. 95% effective for the Pfizer vaccine. I won't go into a lot more detail there. There's more misleading claims. First, amongst Adventists, oh, Ellen White was against vaccination. Not true. She herself was vaccinated against smallpox, which is a live virus vaccine, and she recommended her staff to do likewise. There's a claim that DNA vaccines will enter our cells and change our own DNA. That's not true either. Some of the vaccines, the ones that are just mRNA, just cannot get into the nucleus. It's not possible. It doesn't happen. They get into the cytoplasm, but not into the nucleus. So they can't affect the DNA. However, the Oxford vaccine is an adenovirus, and it's actually a DNA virus. And it does enter the cell, and it does enter the nuclei of your cells, but it doesn't combine with our DNA. We know that there are some normal viruses, so-called normal, that do mix their DNA with ours. And they're mainly what we call retroviruses, like the HIV virus. And it's been estimated that 10% of the human genome is actually bits of virus that have been accumulated over the centuries. And most of them don't do anything. Some of them actually conferred benefit to human beings, but I won't go into that too much. It's out of the purview of this. The other thing is that the chimpanzee adenovirus vector of the Oxford vaccine, it's been engineered so it can't replicate in our cells. It just can't do it. Okay, a few more. This is an ethical one, that vaccines are developed from aborted fetal tissue. Now, it's mostly not true, but the SARS-2 virus, where they need to get the virus and they need to get some of the protein from the virus in order to create vaccines, and they have to cultivate the virus in cells, and some of the cells that they may have been cultivating the virus were derived from a fetal tissue from an abortion performed in 1973. The fetal tissue, the cells have been multiplying thousands of times and thousands of generations ever since in laboratories, in tissue culture, and they have a very tenuous connection to the original situation. The vaccines themselves do not contain any fetal tissue. Okay. Now, it's been said that some vaccines lead to autism, and we don't know if this will happen with COVID vaccines. Well, this is completely untrue. There were claims back in the early 90s by a UK doctor that the MMR vaccine, the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, caused autism. They've been proved to be false, but not only they've proved to be false, they've shown that the original claim that he made was based on false data. He was fiddling the figures. No other vaccines have been implicated with autism risk. And one thing to think about here is that autism develops in childhood. It doesn't develop in adulthood. So COVID vaccines are not being recommended at the present time for children. So that's a bit of a furphy, isn't it? Any more? Natural methods are preferable to vaccines. Sometimes they are. It is true that a number of natural methods do improve our immune systems. And these include things that have been used by Adventists in the past in some of our sanitariums, and some newer ideas as well. For example, hot and cold body immersion is known to improve your general immunity. Exercise in natural forests was demonstrated by a Chinese professor working in Japan to actually stimulate your natural immunity quite significantly. The one with the best evidence is vitamin D supplementation or sunlight exposure, which creates vitamin D. And I'll go into that a little bit later on. And keeping a healthy weight to avoid diabetes and hypertension, because they're known risks for more severe COVID disease. There's little evidence that natural methods actually reduce the risk of catching the virus, except maybe for vitamin D. There's some evidence from trials that vitamin D supplementation reduces the risk of both catching the virus and progression to more severe disease, but probably not as much as vaccination. Nevertheless, it's wisely suggested that vitamin D supplementation, especially for the elderly and those who get little sunlight, is the most significant preventive measure that can be taken in addition to the social measures and masks. Okay, now a little bit about the Christian perspective on the ethics of vaccination. Well, I'd have to say that when you say, oh, I'm not going to have the virus because it might affect me, it's all about me, isn't it? However, we might see this argument, I'm young, I'll only get a cold, why should I be vaccinated? Could this be my grandfather or the person next to me in church? That's the question we should be asking, not is it all about me? Because when Jesus was on the earth, it was not about him, it was about others. And he told us that that's one of our raison d'etre, if I can use the French, as Christians, Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and do unto others as often as you can. Good, not evil. Okay, what are the results of heeding some of the fiction that might be out there? Well, the sad thing, there's some Christians who are falling for some unsubstantiated rumours. It's understandable that social isolation, unemployment, the constant round of depressing news has significant psychological adverse effects. I freely admit that. But Bible-believing Christians have a message of hope. The Bible has something to say about many of the practical issues of life, as well as sound advice and warnings about deception. Now, some might say, well, isn't prayer and faith enough to keep us safe? If that were the case, why did God give Israel strict health laws to help them avoid the diseases of the Egyptians? Couldn't they have just prayed? If that were the case, why did God give Ellen White practical lifestyle instructions in Vision to assist God's people live healthier lives? Couldn't we just pray? Where do we draw the line between prayer as a matter of faith versus the presumption that God expects only that? I think these are things that we need to be looking at quite closely. Next question has been put around by this crazy guy. Is vaccination the mark of the beast, as Kane West proclaimed in July 2020? I think he was later admitted for some psychiatric help. If we as SDA ministers and elders don't know what the mark of the beast really is, may I misquote Paul, we are of all people most pitiable. I think we can deal with that one very quickly. The Bible says that truth shall make you free. And Christ warned about this. He said, take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying I'm the Christ, and will deceive many. You'll hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you're not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. And there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. But he who endures to the end will be saved. So what can we do until the vaccine or a vaccine arrives, which it's just about to? The usual things we've been doing, as well as this. And I'd like to add a few things that we have been told. Be of good cheer. I have overcome the world, Christ says. We have a high priest who's working on our behalf. And from that hymn that we've sung so often, and we have this hope that burns within our hearts. Now, you won't be able to get onto these straight away, but I'll actually forward a copy of this to Kenneth so that you can find some of these resources here, because I can't, in the short period of time we have here, cover all the bases here, but there's some very, very good stuff out on the internet, as well as a lot of not so good stuff. And so maybe Kenneth will be able to share these with you in due course by a copy of the PowerPoint. I don't know if those of you who have been around a while will remember the finally brethren part of the record. So this is my finally brethren. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to us all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him. James 1:5. As they say, finito. I hope that this has been helpful, and maybe we can have some question time now.
Well, thank you for that, David. Very, very informative, and I've learned a lot that I was not aware of. There are some questions in the chat room that we probably need to look at first, and then we'll have hands up, and people can then go from there. Is that all right with you?
Yeah, sure. You want me to look at the chat room, eh? Okay.
Well, I'll just read them for you, David.
Yeah, that's probably better, yeah.
And you can see them as well. So the first one is from Daniel Chong. He's got 3 or 4 of them, and there's also one from Christopher Campos. So Daniel's question is, Does it mean that if frail people like the ones in Norway, 23 of them who died having taken the vaccine, that it's inadvisable for them to take the COVID vaccine? And is there an age group that defines the elderly frail?
Yeah, okay. Well, they looked at the statistics of the likelihood of those elderly people dying anyway, regardless of the vaccine. And they found that there was no difference whether you had the vaccine or not. So what you can do there, I suppose, is you take one nursing home with similar age groups in it that have had the vaccine and one with similar age groups that haven't, and compare the rates of mortality. Now, I had my auntie in a aged care facility in 2019, and she was there for 1 year, and there were probably about 60 or so people in that facility. And almost every other day, somebody was being taken outside for obvious reasons. So aged people and frail people are going to pass away, unfortunately. The vaccine itself, the vaccines cause some relatively minor reactions. For example, my nephew has had one in America. And he said after the second dose, he got the shivers and shakes and muscle aches and pains for about 24, 48 hours, and then he was fine. If that happens in an elderly person, very elderly people are very susceptible to extreme anxiety. And extreme anxiety can actually lead to death. It's well known. So we don't know exactly whether that was involved in the deaths of these people, but statistically, they showed that there was really no increased risk beyond what was likely to happen anyway. Apparently those people some of them were, on the way out already when they had the vaccine.
So then there was another question that came along after you made the quotes with Ellen White and so on in our healthy living. The question came from Chris Campos. With respect then, shouldn't prayer, faith, and living the Adventist health message be sufficient, which would be being responsible to others around us?
Yeah,
so
well, that
vaccination.
Yeah, that's certainly being responsible to others around us. But what we know about the lifestyle is that it offers limited protection. The protection that you get is not as great as the vaccine, as far as we can tell. Now, on the final, or one of the near final slides where I had a lot of references, there's a very, very good YouTube video from a Dr. Schult, who's in Loma Linda University. And he goes through, he's got one segment on vitamin D, and he's got quite a few other segments, videos about this. And I won't say that he actually said this, but the data that he was presenting about vitamin D, for example, showed protection of somewhere around the 50%, maybe a little bit less in certain cases. And it depends very much on whether the person themselves were already vitamin D deficient as to whether the vitamin D will help them. If they weren't vitamin D deficient, well, it may not make any difference. I don't think that we can say, for example, if we look at all other vaccines that have been produced up until now, most of us have had them because we recognize that without them, we quite likely will get infected or could get infected with very serious diseases. And I don't really see that this is any different, frankly, even though the development has been very quick.
David, Daniel had another question. There are claims that a healthy person, after they take the COVID vaccines, may develop common adverse reactions of the mRNA vaccine symptoms, such as fever, nausea, and diarrhea. Does it depend on the individual, or are there different immunity levels as to their reactions?
Well, look, I'm not an expert in this area, but what I've learned is that like everybody, when they have any vaccine, everybody is different. Now, for example, my wife the other day said to me, every time I get the flu vaccine, I get a very sore shoulder. And I go to her, huh? I don't feel it at all. Now, she probably would reply with, well, no brain, no pain, but As I said, my nephew has had the COVID vaccine, the mRNA vaccine, and after the second dose, he got a very brief illness like the flu. So yes, vaccines will produce some temporary effect, but it widely varies from one person to another.
Yeah, that's true. Like in our family, it's the same. My wife feels it more than I do, and her arm is in pain for longer. So yeah, it's a good point that you're making. Good question as well. Daniel has added another question, and this one here is kind of a philosophical one in how to actually deal with situations. Many church members have the mentality of not jumping into taking the vaccine immediately once it's rolled out. They'd like to wait for 1 or 2 years to see if there are other side effects which affect the human beings, and thus it gives them an excuse of not returning to the physical church worship. Any way of tackling that you may think of?
Yeah, well, first of all, if those people are in a high-risk group, let's say they're over 65 or 70, they're taking a risk, because what we have been told is that the vaccine won't necessarily totally eliminate the virus from the community. So you continue to be at risk of catching it. And if you're over 65, and look, some of our people are not that well as well, if you're hypertensive, if you have diabetes, if you're overweight, if you have a history, any history of heart disease, you have a very significant risk of dying from catching COVID-19. And you might say, well, I'll wait 1 or 2 years, but in the process, you may get the virus, and it might not be a very nice outcome. I know that there's a natural conservativeness amongst people, and I'm like that as well with a lot of things. But I think, first of all, you aren't going to get the vaccine, the general population, if you're under 70. You're not going to get it for months. So remember that in the US and in the UK, it will be a year or more after they started their vaccine programs before some people will get the vaccine here. So we will have something like nearly a year of data on that sort of stuff. Yeah, look, it's playing Russian roulette, frankly. I don't believe it's a great idea.
So further to that, there's another question from Fabian, who's asked, he's noticed that there are a number of cases that are actually lowering around the world. So there's not as many people that are contracting the virus. As we know, it's been over a year now, and doctors are doing better at dealing with the effects and so on. And we've been doing a pretty good job here in Australia with holding on to the hotspots and doing the contact tracing. So even though he's not saying that we shouldn't take the vaccine, he's wondering, as we look around at the statistics worldwide, as governments actually enforce lockdowns and such, is it as necessary for us to take the vaccine here in Australia?
Yeah, well, I don't know where all that data is coming from. What I do know is that as the percentage of the population increases with vaccination, the death rate is dropping off. We know that. So we can say, well, the vaccine is being effective in that regard. In Australia, we've been A, lucky, and B, well managed. And so we haven't had the same sort of problem. But you have to ask yourself the question, well, will we continue quarantining people forever? Will we not be allowed to go overseas forever? Will we be locking down whole communities once there's 1 or 2 cases? It's devastating for the economy. Now, on the other hand, what we have is this possibility that as people say, well, the vaccine's being rolling out, I'm going to relax a bit. That's a bad idea. Because until we can get a large percentage of the population vaccinated and know that they're probably not going to get the disease, then if you start relaxing the general rules that we've had now for 12 months, we run the risk of the thing getting away again and affecting those people, especially who haven't been vaccinated. So it's going to take till at least October for as many of the population is going to get it to be vaccinated. So we've got a little bit of a way before we can make any decisions in that area.
And for the aged care company, we've been looking to see what the restrictions are going to be for us. Will we be required to actually have vaccination for our staff? Like the flu vaccination is required of all of our staff, and it's required for those of us who actually come into an aged care facility. And therefore, we need to be prepared that it's possible that it will be required of us as well. So yeah, some really important things to consider. Dr. Christiana Lamina has also added in there a note to go along with what Dr. David has said in the chat room for those of you who are interested. And there's another question: do we still need to practice face mask wearing, social distancing, venue registration, hand sanitizing if our people are vaccinated? That's a good question, Daniel. We don't know what the regulations from the government will be, but as Dr. Pennington was saying, it's actually good practice for us to have a lot of that in place already, so that we can ensure good, cleanly, hygienic environments. And that does make a huge difference. And for those of you who are pastors, you are super spreaders. You can go from one church to another church, you can preach in another church, and you can actually pass on whatever disease that you've actually picked up from one church in the other church. So keep that in mind. There was a very interesting question from Kenneth about people who have been challenging the mask wearing, saying that they don't do it because they're breathing in their own carbon dioxide. I think Jonathan has given a very good answer in that, you know, we would have intoxicated surgeons if that was the case, and something that we haven't had in a long time. So yeah, that's a good one as well. But again, this does highlight the fact that there are many people who are challenged by the information. And as we are looking around, the amount of disinformation is huge. So there's a question here from Andrew. There are many people that believe that in general, they have the right to choose whether or not to be vaccinated, which is true. Where companies compel their staff to be vaccinated at the possible expense of their employment, are they within the legal rights to decline? Good question. And that's what we're looking into, Andrew, because, and this will be challenged, first of all, in Queensland. So when it comes to vaccination to date, we've actually had 2 employees in our aged care facility who refused to be vaccinated for the flu vaccine when that was mandated last year. And they ended up having some very strong crises that they had to work through. And one of them resigned and the other one got the vaccination and continued to work. So it is a challenge. And again, let me just emphasize that we believe in the liberty of conscience. So you have the right to make the decision as to what you believe is good for you and your family. From a Seventh-day Adventist point of view, as has always been the case, we have actually been very much supportive of vaccination, and the General Conference at this time is also supportive of the vaccination for COVID in the different forms. And you know that the president of the General Conference is a very conservative Seventh-day Adventist, and he would not be making these kinds of statements without having had some really good conversation with theologians and with medical professionals who are giving the best advice that they can for the worldwide church. There's been some good conversation here showing that we have been very lucky in Australia. We haven't had to deal with the effect as such, but if you talk to our friends and family who have Brazilian family, many of our church members and employees have had losses in the Brazilian neighborhoods and have family members who've had 30 and 50 and 70% of their lung capacity taken away. In South Africa, I just met up with Regan, who is a member of the Kellyville Church, a lovely man. He lost his mother and his father, both of whom were in the 60 to 70 age bracket, shouldn't have been in any danger whatsoever to the COVID variant. So we all know people who've actually been affected by this. And we have a lot of Seventh-day Adventist pastors who have been affected and who have lost their lives amongst medical professionals around the world as well. And Jonathan has just listed in Mexico. So this is very important. So, you know, to understand, and you need to recognize that's the reason why we're having the meeting tomorrow with our aged care facilities across the country to chat about how we're going to deal with things, but it's going to be determined by the local state government as well. And of course, each person will then have to make up their mind and determine whether or not they're going to legally challenge the situation, like Andrew's question has brought to bear. The interesting thing for us, and David is on our aged care board, is you can imagine that from a commercial point of view, now we're not talking theological here, we're talking commercial, that a company could stand up and say, all of our employees have had the COVID vaccination, send your loved ones to us, because that institution has not had the COVID vaccination. So all of that has to be measured and weighed out, and to see how best we can walk through this in spirit and in truth, and with that overriding principle of the liberty of conscience. So let me look around here. There's a few more questions coming in. With the current COVID rules, does that mean that our church doesn't need to wear face masks in the worship service and Sabbath school and only restricted to 2 square meters. That is correct. Yes, on Sabbath, I was at church and most of the church members were not wearing face masks, and it was still within the regulations of New South Wales. But it is 1 for every 2 square meters, and singing is still not allowed unless there's 5 meters. And if you do want to have singing, you need to actually have the face mask on, because the spraying of saliva from your mouth, it's as bad as coughing when you're singing without any kind of protection. David, is that correct?
Yes, as far as I know, that is correct. And from the medical point of view, they've done this not with COVID, but they've done this with other scientific techniques to work out what happens when you're singing, when you're talking, when you're sneezing and coughing and so on, as to how far droplets and micro droplets that you can't see will be transmitted. And it's a significant distance. It's, several meters. So that's one of the reasons why we don't want that sort of thing to be going on, as long as there is any risk within our churches. Now, the risk, I'd have to say right now in New South Wales, is very close to zero, because we've gone, 35 days, is it, without community transmission. And it's tempting for people to make their own rules and say, well, look, we haven't had it for more than a month, so we're not going to get it, kind of thing. Remember that we are advised in Scripture that whenever it is not conflicting with God's rules, the rules of the state should be followed.
Yeah, Romans chapter 13 speaks about that at length, and it's an important principle for us to keep in mind. As long as it's not destroying God's rules, then we follow the rules of the government, because we live within the government. We live within the context of their authority. And Paul outlined some very good principles there. There's been a lot of questions, David, as to whether or not you're comfortable with us sharing the recording with our local leadership teams in church. Are you comfortable with that?
Yeah, we were, I have produced about 3 or 4 of these that have gone up on our Waitara Church website and now, I think, disappeared. But throughout the whole pandemic, and I'd be happy to put this up, as long as it goes up there with that proviso at the beginning that, tomorrow things might change. The advice changes on a daily basis, and we need to keep up with what's the current advice. But certainly, I think the vast majority of what we know already is not going to suddenly change. What will happen is we'll have more information added as we learn more and more.
Let me just have a quick question of Pastor Felix. Felix, are you aware of a Ghanaian neurosurgeon who is preaching in our churches, like at Concord and Stanmore?
No.
Okay, because he's being, Dr. Gan is his name. So does anybody know of a Dr. Gan? They might not be a Ghanaian, Felix. I just saw Gan and thought Ghanaian. Does anybody know of Dr. Gan? David, do you know of him?
No.
Yes, I know him.
Yes.
Andrew, you know of him, Andrew?
I don't know him personally, but yeah, I know he's been around for a long time.
Him.
Okay, who else? Sorry, just one at a time. So Andrew, just continue.
Yeah, he's doing some presentations at the Stanmore Church at the moment.
Okay. And does anybody else know him?
Yeah, he's been preaching. He's been
Roger.
preaching around Australia for years on health stuff and like just the natural remedies and all that kind of stuff. He's been around for decades.
All right, great. I haven't heard of him, so if anybody has some information, please let me know. David McKibben, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I think it's a Dr. Robert Gown. I think he's currently doing a series at Guildford Church.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So Christiana knows him as well. So she's our health director and she can liaise with him. All right. Any questions that you'd like to pose via the chat, or you'd like to raise your hand? But if you do that, go down to the page of your Zoom and you'll see that there's a reactions button. If you raise your hand by the reactions button, I can see it much easier than if you raise your hand physically. It's much more difficult to see it, particularly since we're on 2 pages. Okay. So at this point in time, Albin is going to send you the link for the recording of this presentation so that you have access to it and so that you know what the advice is from a church elder of the Waitara Church and of the and of the medical profession as well, so that you have access to it. There's a good question here from Jonathan Biles that I need to just double check on. Can we sing with mask or not? Kenneth, what's the latest on that? Because I may have given some wrong information.
Yeah, so you only up to 5 singers, 1.5 meters apart, 5 meters from the front row, and they can sing without masks. Okay, but they are the only ones allowed to sing.
Without masks?
Without masks.
What about the
singers?
Others with masks? Can they sing? Those with masks?
No, the congregation at this time cannot sing even with masks on.
All right, so that rule hasn't changed yet.
No.
Oh, I've been told that you can hum, and I think that's probably okay.
Yeah, most of us.
As long as you've got a mask on, potentially.
Yeah, hum with a mask. Yeah.
Yeah. So look, and that's a good question that Ben has brought up. Some churches have seen that as not being binding. That's true. The church that I was at on Sabbath certainly sang without any masks. So that's an interesting one, Kenneth, that we'll probably have to work through.
Yeah, well,
Please.
It's a law, so we have to abide by it. It's not advisory. It is the law that there's to be no singing. Yeah, and the other thing too, you don't have to wear masks in church. However, if you find it hard to social distance, then it's preferable that you wear a mask, and it's highly recommended that you wear a mask in congested situations.
Thank you, Kenneth. Any further questions while we have Dr. Pennington with us? If not, you're always welcome to send us an email and send on to him and have him share that with us. All right, and yes, I think that Daniel has shared a very good thought. Walk softly, walk gently, respect people's point of view, respect the fact that they will not always agree with you, respect the fact that some of us right here will not agree with one another. And that's okay, as long as we treat each other with respect. The Lord will sort out the wheat from the chaff in time. In between time, God asks us to be patient because love is patient. Interestingly enough, that when it comes to the whole idea of the busyness of this world, busyness actually prevents us from loving because we don't take the time to live in the moment. And that's why the first inclination of what love is in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 4 is that love is patient. And when we're patient one with the other, we will be able to actually do what it is that God has asked us to do on behalf of the kingdom of heaven. David, thank you very, very much for the time that you've shared with us. We really appreciate you on our Aged Care Board of Directors. I've already shared that this link will be shared with our presidents from all of the other conferences who have not taken the time to actually do something like this for us as pastors, because we're at the front line and we know that this is a challenging environment. And with the amount of information, rightly or wrongly, that is going through, and people's negativity towards any kind of news material and whom they can trust, it's important to be able to look at our theological history, our tradition when it comes to the Seventh-day Adventist Church, our focus on the good of science and where we can use science to continue to give us opportunities to share the good news of Jesus. That is really, really important. So thank you very much for that. And Alban, why don't you close with prayer for us and we go from there.
Let's bow our heads together. Precious loving Father, as we come together as pastors, Lord, we thank you for the opportunity that we have that within the Greater Sydney Conference, Lord, we have leaders and people that know so much, and they're so ready to help each one of us, Lord. So we pray that as a church, as we move into this unknown, that we will always be making informed decisions. We will always be able to make the right choice, and we pray, Lord, that you will continue to bring us that sense of unity and that we can travel together in this journey. We pray for your blessing upon each one of us here. In your name we pray, Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Christiana, you made a comment on mask and breathing. So there is a web page there, brothers and sisters, that you can take a look at and find some more information. You can download it in the chat Zoom area and spend some quality time getting to know the rules and regulations that you are responsible for on behalf of the church and the government.
Sorry, Terry, there was just
Terry,
a question
I
there
have a
about
question
baptisms.
also.
Yeah, baptisms and social distancing.
Yeah, look, what we've said with that is that if you're doing a baptism, you need to make sure and wear a mask when you're doing it, that you have done all of the hygiene. It's very, very short period of time that you're in the water. And as far as we know, that has not been restricted from the government, from what I understand, Kenneth.
Yeah. That's right.
Martin, you had a quick question?
Yeah, it was a question of baptism, but also a question of ordination, because in my church there is a little bit of thoughts and discussions, and some say you cannot do ordination, others say you can do because you touch them on the shoulder and not their skin, and so on.
Yeah, it's a good question, Martin.
Coming up in our church, I need to know.
We did the commissioning service for Abigail, and a few of us actually put hands on her shoulders. The ones around just put the hands towards, because it's symbolic in that sense. There's nothing that is of a magic motion exactly to have the hands on one.
Of the power being transferred.
Exactly. We don't believe in the apostolic succession like the Roman Catholic Church does. In our sense, the way that we've always put the hands on has just been in the handship of fellowship. So we're laying hands, acknowledging that God has called them, that God has actually given them the giftedness for the role. And it would be the same thing for deacons, deaconesses, and elders. And so what we would suggest is that the pastor and maybe one other elder lay hands on them, and the rest can do it in a symbolic manner.
Just sanitize beforehand as well.
And Martin, if you feel that the power has gone out of you when you put your hands on them, better talk to us, because with that maybe COVID has gone as well.
So you mean when I was ordained there was nothing magic? And my wife wasn't ordained; she was commissioned.
Well, this is a different discussion that we don't need to have for today. So let me go to you, Andrew. I noticed that you've unmuted, so I'm assuming you've got a question. Is that correct?
No. Sorry, mistake. Yeah.
David Paddington, can you stay online just for a little bit? I'll just stop the recording now, and then we can. I just want to ask you a couple of questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, brothers and sisters. May the Lord